Associate Dean of Students here, and thanks so much for being on this panel today. I wanted to just sort of provide you a little background. Myself, Corey Fecto from the Career Development Center, Ashley Gomez, a graduate student, and Shannon Marlette, another graduate student, have spent this semester working on voter registration, helping students with absentee ballots, making sure people know about early voting, and reminding people to vote. So we've been doing lots of different marketing and trying to reach out to our students. And really what we came to was a really nice closure would maybe be a reflection on kind of where we're at. Just right a few days after the election, we were not sure where we would be at, and it seems like we're still not. So I was really grateful that Dr. Slater-Beltrow, Dr. Wallace, and Dr. Stein all were willing to be panelists to sort of speak about what's happening right now and helping us unpack the election and providing some really good information. Everyone has the opportunity to unmute themselves to ask questions as we're going through after some brief introduction statements. And then from there, I'll also be monitoring the chat. So if anyone has any questions for our panelists, I'll read those out as time allows. So thank you so much. And with that, I will turn it over to our esteemed panelists.
Thanks a lot, Tricia. I'm gonna sort of get us started, and want to start by thanking you and Corey and your group of people that have been working on this for so long for coming up with the idea to do it at this point, and also for carrying through the PR work that you did and getting the poster and such out there. So we really appreciate that. It's an idea that we'd talked about. Desmond, Bob, and I have talked about it for weeks, and we hadn't really got it going. So it was really great to get that push from you all. What we'd like to do is to facilitate a discussion that clarifies how our presidential election works, where the 2020 election stands today, and what developments are likely to follow in the coming days and weeks. We're going to start with some introductory comments, hopefully quite brief, with the hope that it might clarify things for those who are not super familiar with how the system works and such, the rules and procedures that guide our electoral system, especially the presidential electoral system. After those introductory comments, we would like to encourage everyone to join in, right, with discussion, questions, comments, insights, whatever strikes you. Dr. Wallace will be talking about the varying methods used by the states to collect and count votes. Bob Stein will talk about possible legal challenges in the courts. And I'm going to start by talking about some of the basics of the Electoral College. Again, apologies to anyone those of you who already know how this system works, but we felt like it would be important to go over some of those basics for those who are not super familiar with it. The Electoral College, first of all, it's an indirect process of electing the president. Right? We see ourselves as voting for our preferred candidates, but actually we're voting for a list or a group of selected party officials in each state called electors. Each party has its own lists of electors in each state, and whichever party wins a plurality of the vote, that is, whichever party gets the most votes of those parties competing in the state, wins the votes for its entire list of electors. So we have a winner-take-all system in each state. There are two exceptions, Nebraska and Maine. I don't have time to go into those at this point, but most of the states are winner-take-all systems. The number of electors in each state, right, is determined by their congressional representation. So the number is the combined total of their House representatives in the House and their 2 senators. Each state, of course, has 2 senators. So to give an example, California has 53 members in the House and 2 senators, so 55 total electoral votes. It has the most of any state, right? While small states like Alaska and Wyoming only have 3 because they have their 2 senators and 1 representative in the House. There are 538 total electors 435 from the House, 100 from the Senate, and 3 from Washington, D.C. So with the 538 total Electoral College votes, the winning presidential candidate must win an absolute majority of those votes, or 270. 270 is the minimum. If they don't, it goes to Congress. And I don't have time here to go into the process, how it goes to the House and so forth. But it's a very unlikely situation, though it's possible actually this year, right? Now, in good part, because of this winner-take-all system, a candidate can actually win the presidency without winning a majority of the popular vote. For example, by winning razor-thin majorities in a handful of key battleground states, but losing other states with large populations by landslides in those states, right? So there's this distorted, in a sense, a distorted possibilities of distorted outcomes, where the winner of the Electoral College does not win the national popular vote. This electoral system is also why candidates from both parties target what they identify as the key battleground or swing states. Typically, these are states with relatively large populations that could go either way, right? So they're seen as where you can get the most bang for your buck. And what each party will do is they'll prioritize winning as many votes as possible in those states. And how do they do that? By putting all of their resources, their money, their grassroots organizing efforts, and their campaign stops in those states, a handful of states, typically about a dozen states, which are identified as crucial and could go either way. So this is part of where we get some of the distortions also in the patterns of campaigning and the patterns of voter turnout, right? So I'm not going to go into them here, but I just want to highlight finally a number of the key aspects that are controversial about this system. One is for what purpose was it created historically? We could, if you're interested, we could talk about why the founders created the system this way. A second is what happens if the absolute majority, if there is no absolute majority, what kind of outcome might be, in what direction might the system turn us in that case. A third is the question of faithless electors. These are electors who are supposed to be compelled to vote for their candidate if in their state, their party wins the state. But it's possible, and it has happened numerous times, that an elector will not vote for the candidate they're supposed to vote for. So what happens in that situation? Could faithless electors, these so-called faithless electors, alter the outcome of an election? And fourthly, there are major criticisms of the Electoral College, which already mentioned as I was going through how the system works in terms of overemphasizing certain states, other states neglected, the national popular vote might not produce the president. Okay, so there are a lot of criticisms of the system, and that leads us to the fifth neglected aspect, this question of should we or can we actually get rid of the Electoral College and move towards a system more similar to most other democratic countries today. All right, so I will turn it over to Desmond.
Thank you, Jeff. So I'm just going to talk briefly about sort of different ways that states tally their votes, how individuals can vote in the states, and where things stand in terms of the Electoral College tally today. So throughout this process, we've seen, there are a number of ways that you can vote in your state. You can either vote in person on election day or through early voting if you're in one of the handful of states that have early voting, which can be anywhere from a few days before the election up to maybe a month before the election day. There's also absentee balloting if you're not able to make it to your actual precinct in time to vote on election day. And we've also have mail-in balloting or mail-in voting, where you fill out your ballot and you submit it through the mail. And we've seen an uptick in mail-in ballots because of what's been happening this year with the pandemic. Now, there's some sort of misconceptions out there about what happens with mail-in and absentee ballots. Do they get counted? When do they get counted, etc.? So first, yes, all ballots that are submitted, whether in person, mail-in, absentee, they all get counted. Second, they're typically counted shortly after the polls are closed. All right, so shortly after a polling locations close in the state, vote talliers will begin counting the votes, not just in person, but also their absentee ballots. All right, and those results will trickle in through, get reported to the networks and other media outlets, and then ultimately the media will use those results plus other data at their disposal to try and make projections or calls on who won which states. So today, as of 12:26 p.m. today, there are roughly 5 states that have yet to be formally called or decided one way or the other. All right. Of these 5 states, Trump holds leads in 4 of them. Biden holds lead in the 5th one, Nevada. Trump is leading currently in Alaska, Georgia, North Carolina, and Pennsylvania. Georgia and North Carolina have 99 and 95 and 94% of their vote in. All right, so it's expected that Trump will win those states. 50% of the vote is in Alaska right now, but Trump is still leading by a 2-to-1 margin. Nevada has 76% of its vote in, and Biden is leading by roughly 12,000 votes, give or take. And then in Pennsylvania, 88% of the vote is in, and Trump is leading by roughly 115,000 votes. However, the presumption out there is that there's over 1 million mail-in ballots that still have to be counted. Most of these ballots come from predominantly Democratic strongholds in the state. So the expectation is that whatever lead Trump has now, it's going to slowly dissipate as these mail-in ballots get counted, eventually disappearing. And so when we take all that into account, right now where the Electoral College tally stands is that Biden has 264 electoral votes, Trump has 214. So given where the data stands right now, it looks as if Biden will actually pull off a victory. And with that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Stein.
Thank you, Desmond and Jeff, and thanks again to Tricia for putting this together and for all the work that you, Tricia, and everyone who's been getting out the vote have put in, registering voters this season and keeping people interested in some important stuff. I just want to say a few words about possible court challenges because these are the other main way that the results may be delayed. Desmond was just explaining how the processes in the various states can mean that it might be days or even longer before we know the results from the states. And the court challenges could put it back even further. Back in 2000, probably, if you were around, you'll remember that we didn't have a decision for close to 40 days. It was just under 40 days after the election because of court challenges and recounts that were taking place. So I have been in class for the last hour, so things may have changed dramatically. But last I saw, there's a few major court challenges, or let me put it differently, a few key court challenges that the Trump administration is pursuing. One is in Michigan. They're claiming that the people who are supposed to observe the vote were not allowed to observe the vote as carefully as they should have been. They're also challenging the same kind of thing in Pennsylvania. But in Pennsylvania, they're also challenging the fact that Pennsylvania was accepting votes that were mailed in up to 3 days after the election date, as long as those votes were postmarked by election day. But that was a challenge that went to the Supreme Court before the election. The Supreme Court decided not to deal with the challenge, which meant that those votes could continue to be counted. But they also reserve the right to come back to that decision later. And so the Trump administration is pushing them to do that. They're also challenging a a very archaic part of the Pennsylvania code that says that if someone sends in an absentee ballot and they've made a mistake, they didn't sign the back or something like that, Pennsylvania can notify them, and they have 6 days from the date of the election to correct that ballot, so it will be counted. And the Secretary of State in Pennsylvania has extended that. She said that they will allow it for 6 days after the end of canvassing, which is Friday. So that would be November 12th instead of November 9th. And the Trump administration is challenging that because Pennsylvania law actually says 6 days after the election day. But even if that were to go through, though, I think the number of votes that would affect would be pretty low. And the same thing is going on with the lawsuit in Georgia. They've filed a lawsuit in Georgia, but as far as I can tell, it only challenges 53 votes. So far, most of the lawsuits that have been submitted would not be game changers, except for possibly the one having to do with the mail-in ballots in Pennsylvania. The Trump campaign is also thinking about a lawsuit in Nevada, and they have asked for a recount in Wisconsin. There's no lawsuit that I know of yet in Wisconsin, but they have asked for a recount, which is within their right, according to the election. If the margin of victory is less than 1% in Wisconsin, either candidate can ask for a recount. And so the Trump administration has done that, or the Trump candidacy. But those are the main court challenges I've heard. I wouldn't be surprised if there are more, either to delay the verdict or possibly to try to get the decisions changed. But historically, those cases have not been very successful. And so it's hard to know what would happen this time around, but at least historically, those kinds of election challenges have not been that successful in the courts. In general, the courts want the states to run the process and trust them to do so. And I think with that little introduction from the three of us, we'd like to open it up to questions and discussion and hear what people have.
Before we do that, I just want to sort of give a follow-up. The Trump campaign did hold a press conference or an announcement in Las Vegas this morning. The feeling is they're announcing their lawsuit in Nevada to challenge the vote in Nevada.
Great. And I saw a question from Tim, I think, about Arizona. It's true that as Desmond said, Arizona has been called by a number of news agencies, AP, but not all of them have called Arizona, at least not an hour ago. Arizona is in that same situation as the other states that Desmond talked about, where the lead that Biden has is small, but they are assuming that the votes that still have to be counted are coming from Democratic strongholds, and so that his lead will not shrink. If anything, it will grow. I think the reason that Arizona has still not been called by the New York Times, at least the last time I looked, was that even though they were expecting that lead to grow, in the last 12 hours or so, it's actually shrunk a little bit. And so they're losing confidence in their prediction that those votes are going to break for Biden, the unaccounted votes yet. That's my understanding of what's happening in Arizona.
Bob, one of the questions in the chat had to do with who pays for these lawsuits that you just spoke about.
These lawsuits should be paid for by the campaigns. If they are campaign lawsuits, they should be paid for by the campaigns. One of the ones that I mentioned in Pennsylvania is being run by the Republican Party, so that would be paid for by the Pennsylvania Republican Party. But in theory, these lawsuits should not be paid for by taxpayers or with tax revenue.
But I have heard that, I've read that the Republican Party has been calling for supporters to make donations also to these legal challenges.
There is another question. If Biden wins Arizona and Nevada, he won't need Pennsylvania, Georgia, and North Carolina? ?
Yes.
And there's
yes.
Yeah.
So Biden is at 264 now. He only needs 6 electoral votes, assuming you count Arizona in the Biden column. and Nevada has 6 electoral votes. So that would be just enough. So Biden could lose Pennsylvania, North Carolina, Georgia, and Alaska, and he would still have the minimum vote needed to win the Electoral College.
Hey,
That's-
Just a
a
note
friend of
about
mine,
that. Hang on just one sec, Tim. Just a quick note about that. Jeff was mentioning that the Electoral College is a winner-take-all system in all but a couple states, Maine and Nebraska. And that turns out to be really instrumental for the math that we just heard, because Biden did win 1 electoral vote from Nebraska this year, which is unusual. The way it works in Maine and Nebraska is that the electoral votes are split up first by congressional district, and then there's an at-large vote for the whole state. And so obviously Biden won the popular vote within 1 of those congressional districts in Nebraska, and that would get him to 270 if he were to end up winning Nevada and Arizona. Sorry, Tim.
I was just going to say that a friend of mine, this is not confirmed, but a friend of mine just texted me that that Biden has pulled ahead in Pennsylvania.
He was getting about 78% of the vote, more or less, of the vote that has been coming in recent days. So that would stand to reason.
This is obviously why it was crucial for the Trump and the Republican Party to try to stop that vote or limit that vote as much as possible.
Another question from Beth Ann. Do you think that the court systems will continue to uphold the idea that states should run and oversee elections given the current environment?
That's a good question. It's a hard one, right? So, I mean, the most famous case when the courts really didn't do that was in 2000, when the Supreme Court stepped in and basically redirected the Florida state court's decisions. That was an equal protection case. The claim that the Supreme Court made there was that votes were not being treated equally because they were asking to recount votes that were undercounted and not overcounted. So I won't get into all that, but it was a mess. But I guess the point is that the court did find a way to say that they had a constitutional duty to step in. Given the fact that the Trump administration has so aggressively filled the federal courts and the Supreme Court, I think Provost Dobie's point is a good one, right? The courts out there may not defer to states as they have in the past. I wouldn't make a prediction on that. Most of the cases that have been filed have to go through the state court system first, however. So in that sense, the federal court appointments don't matter as much unless it were to get to the Supreme Court. But I guess the short answer is I wouldn't predict anymore what's going to happen.
Another question is, how is it ensured that a person doesn't vote by mail and in person?
All the states have these, they have different names for them, election books or something like that, where they have big databases now with the names of the voters. So if you vote early in New York, for example, you will have noticed that they were very careful to take your name, and that name then goes into that database where they keep track of who's voted. If you then try to vote again on election day, or you sent in a mail ballot, when they open that, it would be flagged as a second attempt.
Just again, reading from the chat, I think the courts will uphold the states running and overseeing elections. Courts have no precedent in deciding elections in this country. I don't even think they're allowed to. Not sure about that, but I think the courts will try desperately not to decide an election winner. I don't know that there's a comment back to that. NPR and AP haven't reported Pennsylvania yet. If Biden wins and Trump contests the results, can Trump become the president at the end by winning the legal battle?
It depends. I mean, it depends on like which legal battles he win and how many votes that affect. I'm not going to go out on any limbs of saying how much the likelihood that's going to happen or that a large swath of votes will be affected. But given some of these, but I will say that in some of these states where there are challenging the votes, the margin is very tight. Um, so it is plausible, but I would say it's highly improbable that something like that could happen.
I think one important possibility along those latter lines is the recount in Wisconsin. They will obviously ask for a recount because it was so close. And a recount, you don't know what's going to happen. And if, of course, if that switches on the recount to Trump, that changes everything as well. If it's 270, if Biden only has 207.
That is true, but even there, I mean, again, historically at least, recounts have led to shifts in numbers on the scale of the hundreds or low 1,000. That would be a big switch. If 1,000 votes were to be changed in a recount, that would be large historically. And so if Biden is up by 20,000 votes or so, it would be very unusual for that big of a margin to be changed by a recount.
Yeah, my understanding of recounts is based on Latin American recounts, and they're bigger, much bigger swings. Sorry about that.
Another question, what do they do with the flagged vote? Which one counts, first or last?
That's a very good question. I don't know the answer to that. My guess is it's the first one, that the first one that's been recorded is the one they stick with, but I don't know the answer to that.
Another question, I heard there are 16 states which have legislation that gives all their electoral college votes to the national popular vote. It was Colorado mentioned that this is their method now. Is this current, and will other states start to follow suit to make national voting by majority and eliminating the outdated Electoral College?
This is the thing called the National Popular Vote movement. And the way those laws are written, so that is correct that 16 states have passed that law to say that that state's electoral college votes must go towards whoever wins the popular vote, regardless of who wins in that particular state. However, the way that law is written is that it only goes into effect, that law only goes into effect if so many other states have passed the same law that the total electoral college vote would be determined by all those states. I didn't explain that very clearly, but here's the point. Those laws, even if they've been passed in Colorado, don't take effect because you would need enough other states to pass them, and they don't have that yet. They don't have a number of states that have passed the law that would trigger those laws to go into effect. So Colorado, for example, is still sending its electors to whomever wins the vote within Colorado.
Another.
Can I just follow up too? That this comes out, the campaign, the Interstate Compact, the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact comes out of kind of a lot of people's desperation. It started after Hillary Clinton won the national popular vote but lost the election, really took hold after that. And it's kind of out of recognition of the near impossibility of an amendment to the Constitution to do away with the Electoral College. And so they've turned to this strategy, which I think, a lot of intelligent people are really pushing this as a possibility, but certainly it won't be anytime soon. And there would probably be legal challenges to it and so forth. I don't think that it's all that realistic either. And I don't know how Dr. Wallace might feel about that. But I think it's a really important question to think about.
Not really. My feeling about it is basically like, why are states doing this? I mean, at the end of the day, we have this system in place. The number of times in which we have a discrepancy between the popular vote and the electoral college winner, it's only roughly 5 times. All right. It's few and far in between. And also, I have a big problem with this idea that a state is going to award its electoral votes to the winner of a national popular vote when that national popular vote can be driven by running up the margin in states and popular states like California and New York. So a state like Colorado is basically going to say, we're going to ignore what our voters are saying within our borders in Colorado, and we're going to go with what people in California and New York says. That sounds problematic.
Another question in our chat: how does urbanization affect the Electoral College?
Urbanization affects the Electoral College in the sense that what we're getting, although Dr. Wallace correctly pointed out that we've had very few situations in which the popular vote winner didn't also win the Electoral College vote, that is likely to happen more and more because of urbanization. In other words, we have states that have very large urban centers, and those states, those votes all go to one candidate in the Electoral College. But with lots of more rural states continuing to have more influence in the Electoral College than the urbanized states. Let me give you an example, because I made a hash of that. If you look at North Dakota. North Dakota has a population of, let's say 700,000, but let's pick 600,000 just to make the math easy. They have 3 Electoral College votes. So essentially they get 1 Electoral College vote per 200,000 voters. California has 55 Electoral College votes, but a much, much, much bigger population. If you divide out the population by Electoral College votes, it's essentially 600,000 votes per Electoral College elector. So the point is that North Dakota gets 1 elector per 200,000 people. California gets 1 per 600,000 people. And it's that disparity that has people uncomfortable with the Electoral College these days. And that is related to urbanization.
Tim has his hand up there.
Yeah, I have kind of a question slash a comment slash question. When I was younger, I used to be a defender of the Electoral College as kind of a student of history and so forth, because I felt like it, I took the party line that it sort of forced politicians to pay attention to the heartland rather than running only on the highly urbanized coastal areas where they could win the presidential race. But what's happened in our sort of highly, polarized society since then is that these 6 swing states end up being the total focus for the politicians. That's where they campaign. That's where they invest their resources. That's where you can go and, they and New Hampshire and Iowa in the primaries. The rest of us are just ignored. No one bothers to come to New York because they already know how we're going to vote. So I feel like the Electoral College merely substitutes like 6 states to focus on rather than that what they were trying to fix of not having the coastal areas be the focus. I'm sorry, that's not what they were trying to fix. That used to be our old rationale for it. There's a question about why we have it, and that's different.
So I can answer that question, and you hit on 2 points here. All right, why do presidential candidates not come to New York during the nomination process? Because New York is typically late in the nominating sequence. So by the time your New York primary comes around, you already know, you have a pretty good idea who the nominee is going to be. So unfortunately, it doesn't matter. And why presidential candidates don't come to New York for the general election? Because most times New York is going to vote for one candidate, and that's the Democrat. So there's no point in the Democrat coming here when they already know they've got the state in the bag. There's no point in the Republican candidate coming to New York because they're not going to win the state anyway. That's a waste of resources.
Right, but I do think though that like substitutes what's important to Wisconsin and Pennsylvania and Ohio. That elevates that to be the all-consuming issues for the presidential election, and people don't particularly care about New York and California issues because they don't have to campaign for us.
No, absolutely, yeah, and it's because those states you have the probability of winning it is much closer. Whereas in California, New York, and I would say even up until this election, states like Texas and in the South, you already know how those states are going to go. So when you start off your general election campaign, can it start off with sort of a electoral college tally floor? They already know there's a handful of states that, regardless of what happens, barring something absolutely bonkers happening, certain states are going to be in their column and they can bank that vote. So then they can turn their attention to other more competitive states.
Another thing that happens is that another way of thinking of it is to say that it empowers voters in certain states relative to others. I mean, if you're a voter in Pennsylvania, you have much more power to determine the outcome of the election than a voter in California or New York. And so if we think of a democratic system as one person, one vote, equal voting power, that's not what we have. So it's another way in which, Dr. Stein was mentioning how, voters in California don't have the same weight as voters in a small, relatively unpopulated state. And this is another way in which it just distorts the power of voters in different ways.
I have a question. So I was recently, the New York Times did a piece about the Electoral College and the history of it, and how it was there was a bill presented to the Senate in, I believe, 1969, following Nixon's election, to get rid of the Electoral College. And it was supported by the president, who won the popular vote and the Electoral College vote, because they felt that it wasn't the best way to represent voters and the sentiment of America. And it was eventually filibustered out of the Senate by South Carolinian senators, and historians believe it was, due to like segregation and race issues, and voter suppression of minorities in those states. So why is that sentiment lost? Why did that bill die in 1969? And even though we have a strong push from at least voters now to go to a popular vote system, why has it not been reintroduced in government?
It's rare. It's a great question, Aaron. And it's rare for a president to support that, because it's, by definition, the people who are in power are the ones who benefited from the Electoral College. And so they usually don't have an incentive to change it because it worked for them. And an amendment is really hard to get through. A proposed amendment is hard to get through Congress because you need 2/3 of both chambers. And it's usually the case that one of those parties is benefiting from the Electoral College at that moment, and they are unlikely to want to change it. And you can see that right now, right? If President Trump goes on to win this election, it will be 2 elections in a row where the Republican candidate won without having the popular vote, being quite a ways down in the popular vote. So there would be very little incentive for the Republican Party at this moment to change that system. So I think that there are probably lots and lots of people who want to change the Electoral College system, but politically, it's a very difficult thing to do. Even, Colorado in 2004, Colorado put an amendment on there, or a proposition on their ballot. And what they said was, why don't we change our system from winner take all to splitting up Electoral College votes based upon the proportion of the vote? And that would be much closer to an actual popular vote election if all the states were to do that. The problem is, what Colorado realized is, if they get to a point where they are just dividing their votes up based on the vote in the state, then they're likely to be always having a 5-4 vote, right? In other words, one candidate gets 55%, the other candidate gets 45%, so the Electoral College votes get split up 5-4. So Colorado's total impact on the election is 1 Electoral College vote. They realize that no candidate is going to come there and pay attention to their issues if all they can get is a net 1 vote. So they defeated that proposition, and it just gives you an idea of how difficult it's going to be to change the Electoral College.
And that's historically, I believe, isn't it? You guys correct me if I'm wrong, but historically, that's why the Electoral College became winner take all in the early 1800s, because initially it was based in most states on district level voting. But the states made the switch one after another. By 1832, I think it was pretty much universal that states were winner take all. But up until that point, it was a lot of states went by district level, but they realized they didn't have the same clout in choosing the president. So it's the same basic logic.
Yeah.
Looking at questions in the chat, can you talk about why so many of the pollsters got so many state tallies wrong on Tuesday?
So it's not so much that they got it wrong. I mean, if you read a number of the polls, nationally, they had Biden ahead. He was ahead in a number of the battleground states, but a number of those polls were in the margin of error. And a lot of times what will happen is the closer you get to election day, Republicans tend to outperform Democrats on actual election day voting. So that's one thing. And then the other thing, and I think this is the more important issue regarding the polls, is that what you probably have is a systematic underestimation of support for President Trump in the polls, and the polls are just simply not picking that up. Now that could be due to a number of different reasons. That could be people who they're refusing to partake in the poll. They might even say lie in the poll. We just don't know. But it's really hard to sort of to get a poll done when you don't have participants acting faithfully and sincerely in said poll, and to also get them to just flat out participate as well. Response rates for surveys and public polls have been on a steep decline for years now. So I think given all those different factors, if you sort of take these polls as gospel, they're going to paint one picture where you're expecting this landslide victory for Biden and Democrats down the ballot, and that simply just did not happen.
Another question is, can the presidential election be canceled because of legal battles so that we would have to do a revote?
No, I don't think that can happen. I mean, I think what Dr. Wallace was saying earlier, I think is correct, that if the legal battles are successful, what that would do is simply change the vote count for whatever state the legal battle was successful in. And so the Electoral College vote would change. It's not, the day that matters is not when a state comes out and says, this is who won our election. The day that matters is when the electors actually sit down to vote in that state. And whichever group of electors is assigned to vote that day is the one that is going to, that's the party that's going to win in that state. So if a legal challenge were to overturn, for example, the Michigan result, then on the day that the electors sit down to vote, it would be the Republicans the Republican electors who did the voting. And that's the result that gets transmitted to Congress, who tallies the overall Electoral College vote. So what we see on the news is the announcements made by secretaries of state and things like that, but there's still an official process going on underneath, which includes the electors actually getting together, voting, and that vote being certified by the Secretary of State and then sent to Congress. So the legal battles would just change the result of those things.
Can you all talk about what happens if we come up with a tie? What's the procedure?
It would go to Congress, and the House chooses the president, would choose the president, and the Senate would choose the vice president. There's a different procedure for voting in each. In the House, It's not one representative, one vote. It's each party's delegation in the House has one vote. So,
State,
sorry?
state delegation.
Each state delegation has one vote. And so at present, it looks like the Republican Party has control of 28 or 29, correct me if I'm wrong on that as well, Desmond, 28 or 29 state delegations, and the Democrats about 20 or 21. So if it did go to the House, it's extremely likely that President Trump would be reelected. In the Senate, each senator has one vote for the vice presidency, and the winner would have to win a majority of the vote in the Senate.
And, you know, it could, I mean, I'm not sure if this could still happen, but I guess it could end up in the House, even if these legal battles make it impossible for us to determine which electoral group should vote for a particular state. Just to go back to the question, could we have a revote? That I don't think that would happen. If they couldn't determine which electors should come out of Michigan, for example, then no candidate would get the majority, and so again, it would go to the House. That's what happened, for example, in 1876. They had a dispute over which electors counted from a couple different states, and so they finally just sent it to the House, and the House decided. And so I think the same thing would happen here instead of a revote.
One of the other questions here, what are your thoughts on the Senate races and the implications of a Republican or a Democrat-led Senate?
I'll take that question. So if there are any Republicans out there, or Republican supporters out there, the prospects of a Biden presidential victory might be disappointing for you. However, in that possible loss, there is victory, because their congressional Republicans exceeded expectations for them on election day. So it looks like there's a good chance that Republicans are going to keep the Senate. They'll have a slimmer majority, but it'll still be a majority nevertheless. There's still a couple of Senate races that are yet to be decided. And in fact, in Georgia, both of their Senate races have to go to runoffs in January, but the prospects would probably be good for Republicans in that standpoint. And then in the House, you have really good news because Republicans expanded their minority. Democrats are still going to be in the majority, but they've taken some hits. A number of their incumbents lost re-election. And so with that prospect, it sets Republicans up really well to be a check against a potential Biden administration. And it sets Republicans up electorally really well for the 2022 midterm elections, where there's a possibility that Republicans could, in fact, retake the House of Representatives and potentially expand their majority, which would then set them up really well for beating the Democrats for the White House in 2024.
And the strong showing by the Republicans in the House actually goes back to the last question about how the House would vote for the president, because as Jeff was saying, the vote in the House is based on state. Each state gets one vote, but it's not the current Congress that would vote. It's the Congress that has just been elected. So if the Democrats were to have won a few more states, that could have changed the outcome if the vote had gone into the House to decide the presidency. But it looks as though once again, there will be more states with the Republican majority delegation in the House than Democratic states.
Somebody asked a question about when voting in person, does using a pen versus a Sharpie make a difference? They're just seeing a lot of arguments on social media, confused, curious. If you could respond to that. If you know.
I don't know much about that.
I actually heard that being explained on my way over this morning, and an election official who was counting votes explained that that's like a false rumor that's going around, and that Sharpies do not negate a ballot. In fact, it's generally preferred because they don't smudge as well as much as regular pens. So there's no truth to the don't use a Sharpie rumor.
Thank God.
Hi all, I actually can speak to that. I work as an election inspector or a poll worker for Allegheny County, and we actually give out Sharpies to folks who are coming to vote in person. The machines can read either Sharpie or pen. They seem to prefer Sharpie. So if you voted with a Sharpie and fed your ballot into the machine, it counted.
I know we're getting very close to time, but is there any last questions? I do want to thank our panelists for answering lots of questions that seemed to be all over the board. So that was really great and really informative. And I just want to say thank you for all the work and sort of helping to clear up some of the confusion that we hear as we kind of get into the weeds here.
Thanks.
I believe there was one question that we haven't covered. And I guess this would be good for you, Dr. Stein. What would we say to Socrates' criticisms of pure democracy?
What a fine end note.
Yeah, I guess I'm not so opposed to pure democracy as Socrates was, at least as he stated in the Republic. But I think that the worry about pure democracy is that you can get a demagogue as a leader, somebody who appeals to people's emotions more than to their reasoned views of regarding issues that matter to the country. That was the whole point of the Electoral College, right? That was why the framers of the Constitution were worried about turning the vote over directly to the people for the presidency. They were worried that someone would come along who was very charismatic and would grab the attention of the public, and we'd end up back in an autocracy, which is what they were trying to avoid after having left Britain. So, once they come up with this idea of the Electoral College, then they had trouble getting some of the states to go along with it. For example, the southern states, and that's what led to the representation system where they had they counted the senators as well, which gave more power to the smaller states. Anyway, in any case, that gets back to the Electoral College. But I think even if we were to go to a direct vote for the presidency, that is not a direct democracy. It seems to me that a direct democracy, in the sense that I think you're talking about, where people are really voting directly on issues, wouldn't be good for a country of 330 million people. That we need the process of electing people who can make it their job to try to learn more about the issues and vote in a more deliberative way. But that's just my own thought on that. I'd be curious to hear everybody else's too, not just Jeff and Desmond.
I think there are a lot, since nobody's speaking up, I just would say in response to that I think there are a lot of ways that we can increase participatory forms of democracy at the local level, in particular state level. And, different countries have been experimenting with this. Brazil, the country I study, has done a lot of participatory type things that take us closer to direct democracy, but in ways that have not led to problems. Really, they've been, in many cases, very successful in expanding direct voice of the citizens in decision making. So, on that side, I would say that I'm at least optimistic that innovations can come along that will increase direct forms of participation.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point, Jeff. And there have been studies done where they have people vote on an issue, and then they have them discuss, right? Maybe 40 people, they get together at 40 people in a room and have them discuss the issues and then re-vote. And the votes typically change significantly after there's been a deliberative process. How to build that into an electoral system on such a massive scale, I'm not sure, but it's true that there's interesting work being done in participatory democracy.
I see one last question in the chat. Tim, do you want to ask that since, do you want to unmute yourself? Maybe we can finish this last one.
I've been hearing and reading also about like the Electoral College and racism and how it, that's a sort of a troubling part of its past. I thought I'd be interested to hear your thoughts or comments on that as well.
From my understanding of how the Electoral College came about in the Constitutional Convention in 1787 was that the worry that the people in that convention had was demagoguery. And so they created this buffer system where each state would choose what they were hoping would be wise people. And in their heads, those were wise men who would then choose the president. They didn't have a perception of parties. In fact, they were against parties. So they didn't think there were going to be party politics. So they were hoping that each state would choose a set of wise people who could then choose a good president. But once they had that idea in mind, they then had to get all the states to join. And the southern states were not going to join that unless they had more power than they had just based on the population of voting members of those states, because their populations were low compared to the North if you didn't include the slaves. If you did include the slaves, then their population was much greater than the North. They would have been much more powerful. And that is the origin of the odious 3/5 rule in the Constitution, which counted slaves for the purposes of voting as 3/5 of a person, right? For the purposes of determining the population of a state. So in that sense, Tim, I think it's very connected, right? How the Electoral College and representation in the House in general came about was very related to trying to get the southern states to join the Union. The northern states thought that they couldn't get the South without giving them something. They didn't want to count slaves as full people. And so they came up with this awful innovation.
I would also just, there's a really excellent article on this, if anyone really wants to follow up with it, by Wilfred Codrington. Wilfred Codrington, published originally in The Atlantic. It's called The Electoral College's Racist Origins. And I happen to have read it, but it goes over a lot of what Bob was talking about, but it really gets into the nitty-gritty and the debates about this question.
And the framers who were in that room, they knew what they were doing, right? So if you sometimes hear that, well, that's how everyone thought in those days. But if you look at some of the diaries or Madison's notes on the Constitution, you'll see that there were some members of that framing convention who said, what we've done here is shameful. Like to allow this slavery, what we're doing is on the backs of the slaves. And there were definitely people who knew that. It wasn't as though this wasn't thought of.
What was the name of that article again, Jeff?
The Electoral College's Racist Origins.
Okay, and in The Atlantic?
In The Atlantic.
Okay.
Just wanting to be sensitive to time, and in case any of our panelists have a class to teach at 1:20, but I'll keep the meeting open for as long as people have questions or want to engage in dialogue, or until our panelists need to run away, but just kind of making sure that we're aware of time. Thanks, Corey, for posting the link to it in the chat. So for anyone who is interested.
Yes, thank you for that.
I have a question for the panelists. Did you think the election was going to go this way, as not knowing in so many states? I mean, all along it was felt that there were a couple of states that probably would take a lot longer, but did you think it would take this long for us to decide in all the states that we are still undecided?
I did.
Okay.
I did not. I thought it was, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania have rules that they can't start processing the ballots until
Right.
election day. And by that, I don't mean counting, just processing. They're not even allowed to open the ballots and check the names and get them ready to be scanned for that to happen on election day. They can't even start opening them until election day. So I thought Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania would take a long time, but I thought the other states would be done by now. So I was surprised.
Mm-hmm.
I say I wasn't surprised for some of those similar reasons, because of the fact that, states have rules in place about when they're allowed to start processing the ballots, how they're supposed to count them. Number of mail-in ballots have to be hand counted, all right? They're not fed into a machine to be counted. And you take into account the fact that there was large scale early voting, a large number of mail-in ballots, what's been happening with the pandemic. So all these factors led me to the belief that it was going to be a minute before we have a result, and that it could be long. Plus the possibility for legal challenges depending on the result.
I was
Thank
also
you.
Not
surprised
to
by
be
that.
too pessimistic, but just so you know, in states like Nevada, even after they announce the votes that they've counted, tonight or tomorrow, whenever they do it, there are still provisional votes that haven't been counted, and votes coming in from military sites which haven't been counted. So if the margin of victory is really, really thin in Nevada, we might not know there for another week or more. I don't think that's going to happen. I think the margin of victory for whomever wins will be larger than the number of those ballots, but just to warn you.
Thank you.
And then there's the question we haven't even got to yet, with what's going to happen in the streets after all this. We'll leave that for another day, I think.
If there is another day.
Yeah. Well, we have to be optimistic.
That's right. I see Amanda's asking a question about the Electoral College, and Amanda, I agree. I don't think it's working anymore. But I was saying earlier that I really don't think that there's going to be much political will to change it. The party who won isn't going to want to change it because it's working for them. And so to get 2/3 of both chambers to vote in favor of proposing a constitutional amendment seems unlikely to me. But, having said that, I think you're right. It's an election like this that can change that. These things tend to happen fairly quickly. There's a wave. And so I can imagine that this election does that, gets the political will generated that would be required to propose an amendment. I don't think it's out of the realm of possibility. I wouldn't bet on it, but I think it's feasible. I think it's most likely if the Democrats at some point, have a big wave election and they get in large numbers in the Senate and the House, then I think it's more likely, because the Democrats are most hurt by this and will continue to be, I think, for quite some time.
Currently 60% of the US population in a Gallup poll said that they would like to get rid of the Electoral College, right? 60%. But to be real, just the way politics works, I don't see that happening. I just don't. It's especially because the Republicans, they've lost 7 out of the 8 last presidential elections, the national popular vote, 7 out of 8. And the long term, it's not getting any better for them. So I just don't see any way they could possibly, even a section of the party, shift in the near future.
So do you think there maybe is more hope for changing the way we vote and using some kind of different ranked voting, for example, that may permit us to kind of excise from, say, the Republican Party, which for some time now has seemed to feel the need to cater to fringe groups, whether or not they agree with their principles, so that Americans may not have to feel like when they vote for one candidate or another, they're making so many sacrifices in their moral judgments about what's right for our country. Because I think if you allow for more parties to be in play, then I don't know. I just, perhaps that would help with some of these divisive issues we have right now, and the hatred and vitriol that are just thrown back and forth between both parties.
True, but there's no incentive for either of the two parties to give up their monopoly on the political system. In fact, I had a friend on Facebook post about how the Democrats in Wisconsin blocked the Green Party, one of the Green Party candidates, from getting their name on the ballot in the state. And so because of that, he decided not to vote at all. He refused to vote for Trump and he refused to vote for Biden. So you sort of have that sentiment as well. So while yes, more parties might be a good thing, the fact is we've basically had a two-party system since our founding, and it's just so ingrained in our political identity that it's not going to change, and there's no incentive for it to change.
Well, maybe not among politicians, but again, the question is, are politicians really still public servants then? If they are just playing partisan politics, then it seems that they are no longer serving us. So how do we make that change if that's the case?
It depends on what do you mean by the public, because while it may not work, while some of people here might, and others might be of that same mindset that politicians are not serving their interests, there are other aspects of the public, other sections of the public that are okay with this. And so you have to sort of balance that out.
I think, Amanda, that the answer might vary at the state level. So I can imagine some states changing their voting systems. Already a handful of states have changed their systems so they don't always have a general election between one person from each party. What they do is they have a general election between the 2 top vote getters in the primaries. So you might have a Democrat facing off against a Democrat in California, for example. So I can imagine some kinds of changes to the system that aren't major, but try to address that a little bit. I agree with Desmond and Jeff that it's not likely to happen at the national level. It would take, as you say, if the general public sort of rose up and got out into the streets and demonstrated to the point where the politicians realized we're going to stop winning because there's just so much unrest, then they might change something. But I agree with Dr. Wallace that there's not that much unrest about the electoral system. Even if 60% want to change it, I don't think the passion for changing it is very high among a large chunk of the population.
Thank you. I had heard, sorry, I don't mean to dominate. If anybody else has questions, can go ahead, but I do have a follow-up to that. I had heard something about certain states agreeing that all of their electors would go towards the wherever the popular vote went.
Amanda, I think you missed, we talked about that earlier.
Yes, I'm sorry. I had a doctor's appointment that interfered, so I missed the first part of the talk. Was it recorded?
Yes.
It was, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, we did record it, and it's gonna actually, I don't know who I have to get approval from, but hopefully it's gonna go on our Bergen Forum YouTube site, just because it kind of fits that theme. So I'm hoping that they'll be able to post it on there for us. But Amanda, I can also make sure to send you a copy when I get a copy from Mari, who's helping us out on this call.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you all for your serving on this panel. It's been great. It's wonderful.
Thank you.
Thanks.
And I think I'm going to have to go. I have my next, this is an independent study at 1:30, so I have to step away.
Thank you.
Thanks everyone for coming.
Thank you
very
all.
much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank
Have a
you.
wonderful rest of your day.
Yeah, you too.
You too.